I'm about to show you something that might shock you about the pain in your shoulders when you try to lift your arms overhead. I'm Dr. Emma Whitmore, and after more than 2 decades working with aging joints and musculoskeletal injuries, examining thousands of shoulders, watching surgeries, and studying what actually happens inside the joint when people lose mobility, I can tell you with absolute certainty that almost everything you've been told about shoulder pain after 60 is wrong. You've probably been told it's simply arthritis, that it's just aging, that once your shoulders stiffen, the best you can do is manage the pain and avoid movements that hurt. Except that explanation is dangerously incomplete, because in many cases, the real problem isn't the joint wearing out. It's a mechanical trap developing inside your shoulder. A slow, silent narrowing of space where critical tendons must glide every time you lift your arm. And that narrowing can turn your shoulder into what I call a biological vice, compressing delicate tissues thousands of times every day. I saw this happen with a patient named Eleanor. Eleanor was 72 years old when she came to see me. A retired teacher, active, healthy, the kind of woman who still gardened every morning and cooked dinner for her grandchildren every Sunday. For nearly 5 years, she had been experiencing increasing pain when she tried to reach overhead. At first it was mild, just a slight pinch when putting dishes away. Her doctor told her it was normal aging and suggested anti-inflammatory medication. Eleanor followed the advice perfectly. For 2 years, she took the medication, avoided lifting heavy objects, and tried to protect the shoulder. But the pain didn't improve. It spread. Soon she couldn't lift her arm high enough to brush her hair. Then came the night pain. The kind that wakes you at 2 in the morning when you roll onto the wrong side. When I examined her shoulder mechanics, the problem became obvious. The space above the upper arm bone, where the rotator cuff tendons must slide every time the arm rises, had collapsed. Imagine a highway tunnel slowly lowering its ceiling until trucks can no longer pass without scraping the top. Every time Eleanor lifted her arm, the tendon was being squeezed between bone surfaces. Not once or twice, thousands of times a day. Eventually, the tendon became inflamed, swollen, and damaged. And here's the terrifying part. This compression doesn't happen suddenly. It develops quietly over years as posture changes and key stabilizing muscles weaken. Your shoulders round forward. Your chest collapses. The shoulder blade tilts. And the tunnel through which your tendons must travel becomes smaller and smaller. Comment below and tell me your age and whether lifting your arms overhead feels tight or painful. Because if it does, you may already be developing this hidden narrowing inside your shoulder joint. But before I show you the simple movement mistake that accelerates this process, you first need to understand the biology happening inside your shoulder right now. Now I'm going to explain the biology of what's actually happening inside your shoulder when this painful pinching begins, because once you see the mechanism clearly, the symptoms many people over 60 experience suddenly make terrifying sense. Your shoulder joint is not like your hip joint. The hip is a deep ball and socket structure built for stability. The shoulder is different. It's built for freedom of movement. The head of the humerus, the rounded top of your upper arm bone, sits inside a shallow socket called the glenoid. That design allows your arm to reach in nearly every direction, but it comes with a price. Stability must be created by muscles and tendons rather than bone. For small muscles, known as the rotator cuff, act like biological cables holding the ball of the shoulder centered in the socket while you move. But above that ball is a rigid roof of bone called the acromion, and between the ball and that roof lies a narrow passageway where the rotator cuff tendons slide every time your arm lifts. Think of the space like a parking garage with a very low ceiling. When everything is working properly, the car fits easily underneath. The tendons glide through the space without friction. But now imagine the car rising upward toward the ceiling every time it moves. Eventually, the roof starts scraping the top. That scraping is exactly what shoulder impingement is. The humeral head migrates upward during arm movement, and the tendon becomes trapped between the bones. This is where posture enters the picture. When your shoulders round forward and your upper back collapses, a posture incredibly common after decades of sitting, driving, and looking down at phones, the shoulder blade rotates forward and downward. That subtle change tilts the roof of the shoulder joint closer to the humeral head. Suddenly, the garage ceiling drops lower. Even before you lift your arm, the space is already reduced. Then something even more dangerous happens. The rotator cuff muscles that normally pull the humeral head downward become weaker with age if they're not used properly. Without those stabilizing forces, the powerful deltoid muscle, the big muscle covering your shoulder, pulls the arm upward during lifting. So instead of the ball gliding smoothly in the socket, it rides upward toward the roof. First posture lowers the ceiling. Then muscle imbalance raises the floor. The result is a crushing compression zone where the tendon must travel thousands of times every day. This is why people often describe a sharp catching sensation halfway through raising the arm. That moment is when the tendon is literally being squeezed between bone structures. Under a microscope, what I see in those tendons during surgery is heartbreaking. The smooth collagen fibers that should glide effortlessly begin fraying like the strands of a rope dragged repeatedly across rough concrete. Inflammation develops. Fluid accumulates. The tendon thickens. And that swelling makes the space even smaller, creating a vicious cycle of compression and damage. A large observational study often cited in discussions of shoulder mechanics followed older adults experiencing early impingement symptoms and found that many lost significant overhead mobility within 2 years when the mechanical causes weren't addressed. Not because their joints were wearing out, but because the tendons were being mechanically abused with every overhead movement. I remember another patient named Harold. Harold was 76, a retired electrician who had spent decades working with his arms above his head installing wiring. When he came into the clinic, he told me he could no longer lift his arm high enough to place a book on a shelf. His doctor had diagnosed general shoulder degeneration and prescribed rest. But when I observed his movement pattern, the cause was clear. As soon as he raised his arm, the shoulder blade failed to rotate properly. The humeral head shot upward like a piston, jamming the rotator cuff tendon into the acromion. Every single repetition of that movement was crushing the tendon. Harold wasn't wearing out his shoulder. He was pinching it repeatedly like someone closing a door on a garden hose over and over again. Comment shoulder below if raising your arm above your head produces a sharp pinch or catching sensation. That feeling is often the exact moment the tendon becomes trapped in this narrowing tunnel. But posture and rotator cuff weakness are only part of the story. There is a second mechanism developing silently in many aging shoulders, one that most doctors never explain to their patients. It involves the muscles that control the position of the shoulder blade itself. Because the shoulder blade is not fixed to the rib cage with a rigid joint, it floats, controlled by a network of stabilizing muscles, including the lower trapezius and middle trapezius. When those muscles weaken, and this happens in millions of people who spend decades sitting with rounded shoulders, the shoulder blade tips forward and slides outward along the rib cage. Imagine a crane lifting a heavy object. If the base of the crane becomes unstable, the entire structure shifts out of alignment. That is exactly what happens in the shoulder. The blade fails to hold the correct angle, the roof of the shoulder tilts downward, and the space for the tendon shrinks even further. This is why so many people feel relief when they consciously straighten their posture before lifting their arms. When the chest lifts and the shoulder blades retract, the roof of the joint rotates upward and suddenly the tendon has room again. It's like raising the ceiling of that parking garage just enough for the car to pass safely. But most people never address the deeper muscular imbalance causing the collapse in the first place. Instead, they avoid movement, which weakens the stabilizers even more. The shoulder stiffens, the tunnel narrows further, and eventually the tendon damage becomes severe enough to tear. That's the point where surgery often enters the conversation. But here's what most people never hear. This process can often be interrupted long before that stage if the mechanical forces inside the shoulder are corrected early. And in the next part, I'm going to show you the exact movement patterns and muscle activations that begin reopening that compressed space inside the shoulder joint before permanent damage occurs. Now we reach the part most people are never shown in a doctor's office, because the moment you understand how the shoulder actually restores its space, you begin to see why so many treatments fail. Pain medication does not reopen the tunnel inside the joint. Rest does not reposition the bones. And injections may calm inflammation temporarily, but they do not change the mechanical forces crushing the tendon every time the arm lifts. To reverse shoulder impingement, you must change the geometry of the joint. That means retraining three critical systems working together: posture, shoulder blade stabilization, and rotator cuff alignment. Think of your shoulder like a suspension bridge. The bridge deck, the humeral head, must remain perfectly centered while cables stabilize it from multiple directions. If even one cable weakens, the deck tilts, traffic shifts, and pressure concentrates in the wrong place. The first system controlling this alignment is posture. When the chest collapses forward and the shoulders round inward, the entire shoulder blade rotates forward. Imagine holding a flashlight attached to your shoulder blade. When posture collapses, that flashlight points downward toward the floor instead of outward where it should be guiding arm movement. That downward tilt lowers the roof of the shoulder joint and instantly reduces the space available for the rotator cuff tendon. One of the simplest ways to see this is something I ask many patients to try in the clinic. Sit upright. Lift your chest. Pull your shoulder blades gently back as if you're placing them into your back pockets. Now slowly raise your arms overhead with your thumbs pointing toward the ceiling. Many people immediately notice the motion feels smoother and less painful. That's not magic. That's mechanics. You just raised the ceiling of the tunnel the tendon must travel through. Comment posture below if straightening your chest just now made your arm lift feel easier. That simple test reveals how powerful alignment alone can be. But posture correction is only the beginning. The second system controlling shoulder space is the network of muscles that stabilize the shoulder blade itself. Two of the most important are the middle trapezius and the lower trapezius. These muscles function like anchors, pulling the shoulder blade back and downward against the ribcage. When they're weak, the blade slides forward and outward like a loose door hinge. Once that hinge shifts, the entire shoulder joint loses its ideal alignment. I saw this clearly in a patient named Margaret. Margaret was 70 years old, an avid swimmer who suddenly began experiencing sharp shoulder pain whenever she reached forward during strokes. For months, she assumed it was arthritis and stopped swimming. But when we evaluated her shoulder blade mechanics, the real issue became obvious. Her lower trapezius muscles were almost completely inactive. Each time she raised her arm, the shoulder blade tipped forward instead of rotating upward smoothly. That tilt crushed the rotator cuff tendon beneath the acromion, like a book being squeezed between two shelves. We began retraining those stabilizing muscles using simple prone exercises. Margaret would lie face down and slowly lift her arms in shapes resembling the letters A and W, focusing on drawing the shoulder blades together and downward. Within weeks, the shoulder blade began moving correctly again. Within months, she returned to swimming without the sharp pinching sensation that had terrified her. But there is still a third system required to restore shoulder mechanics fully. And this is the one most people completely overlook. The rotator cuff itself must actively hold the humeral head centered in the socket as the arm lifts. Remember the parking garage analogy. Even if the ceiling is raised through better posture and shoulder blade control, the car must still stay centered on the road. If it drifts upward, it will still scrape the roof. The rotator cuff muscles, especially the infraspinatus and teres minor, perform this centering function. One of the most effective ways to activate them is a movement called side-lying external rotation. Imagine lying on your side with your elbow resting against your ribs and bent at 90 degrees. From that position, you slowly rotate your forearm upward toward the ceiling while keeping the elbow anchored at your side. That simple motion trains the external rotator muscles responsible for pulling the humeral head slightly downward during arm movement. Think of them as tiny steering cables guiding the ball of the shoulder away from the roof of the joint. When those muscles strengthen, the humeral head stops riding upward like a piston and begins gliding smoothly through the center of the socket again. Another powerful movement integrates all these elements simultaneously. It's sometimes called a sword draw pattern because the motion resembles pulling a sword from a sheath across your body and lifting it toward the sky. As the arm moves upward across the body, the thumb rotates toward the ceiling. That rotation externally rotates the shoulder while the arm elevates, creating the ideal path for the tendon to travel beneath the acromion. When performed slowly and with proper posture, this movement retrains the shoulder to lift in a mechanically safe arc instead of the impingement-prone path many people unknowingly use for years. Comment mobility below if you want your shoulders to keep working well into your 70s and 80s. Because here's the empowering truth many people never hear. Shoulder impingement is often not permanent damage. It is frequently a mechanical problem that can be reversed when posture improves, stabilizing muscles strengthen, and the rotator cuff regains its centering role. But the final piece, the complete daily protocol that restores shoulder space and prevents the compression cycle from returning, is what I'm going to show you next. Now I'm going to show you the complete protocol that restores the mechanical space inside the shoulder joint and prevents the crushing compression cycle that destroys rotator cuff tendons in so many adults after 60. And I want you to pay very close attention because the order of these steps matters just as much as the exercises themselves. The first step is restoring flexibility to the muscles at the front of the chest and shoulders. Over decades of sitting, driving, typing, and leaning forward, the pectoral muscles shorten and tighten like rubber bands that have been left contracted for years. Those tight tissues pull the shoulders forward and collapse the chest, which lowers the roof of the shoulder joint and shrinks the tunnel where the rotator cuff tendon must glide. One of the most effective ways to reverse this is a simple doorway stretch. Stand inside a doorway, place your forearms or hands against the frame, and gently step forward while keeping the chest lifted. You should feel the stretch across the front of your shoulders and chest. Hold this position for about 30 seconds and repeat it several times. Think of it like slowly pulling open a door that has been jammed shut for years. As those tissues lengthen, the shoulders naturally rotate backward and the acromion, the bony roof of the shoulder, moves upward slightly, increasing the space where the tendon travels. But stretching alone is not enough. Once the chest muscles relax, you must strengthen the muscles that hold the shoulder blades in their proper position. This is where the prone A and W movements become incredibly important. Lie face down on a firm surface or exercise bench with your arms hanging toward the floor. Slowly raise your arms outward and slightly backward while squeezing the shoulder blades together and downward. The movement should be slow and controlled, not fast or jerky. Imagine trying to place your shoulder blades gently into the back pockets of your pants. That action activates the middle and lower trapezius muscles that stabilize the shoulder blade against the ribcage. When these muscles grow stronger, the shoulder blade no longer collapses forward during arm movements, which keeps the roof of the shoulder joint properly aligned. The third component of the protocol strengthens the rotator cuff, so the humeral head remains centered inside the socket during arm elevation. This is where side-lying external rotation becomes essential. Lie on your side with your elbow bent to 90 degrees and resting against your ribs. Slowly rotate your forearm upward while keeping the elbow anchored. Move slowly enough that you can feel the muscles on the back of the shoulder engaging. This exercise specifically strengthens the infraspinatus and teres minor, two muscles that prevent the humeral head from drifting upward into the compression zone. Over time, these muscles act like stabilizing cables, guiding the shoulder through a safe movement path instead of the impingement path that causes pain. Once these foundational exercises are comfortable, the final movement integrates them all into a functional pattern called the sword raise. Start with your arm across your body as if reaching for a sword at your opposite hip. As you lift the arm diagonally upward, rotate the thumb toward the ceiling while maintaining tall posture and engaged shoulder blades. This motion trains the shoulder to elevate while externally rotating, the safest pathway for the tendon to travel beneath the acromion. Think of it as retraining the shoulder's flight path so the tendon glides through the center of the tunnel instead of scraping the roof. I remember a patient named Thomas who demonstrated how powerful this sequence can be when performed consistently. Thomas was 74 years old and had nearly lost the ability to lift his arm high enough to reach a kitchen cabinet. For months, he had assumed surgery would eventually be necessary. But after committing to these exercises daily for several months, stretching the chest, strengthening the shoulder blade stabilizers, activating the rotator cuff, and practicing the sword raise pattern, his overhead mobility gradually returned. The pain that once woke him at night disappeared because the tendon was no longer being crushed with every movement. Comment shoulder health below if you want to keep your shoulders strong and mobile for the rest of your life. Your comment helps others discover this information and reminds you to practice these movements regularly. And if this explanation helped you understand why your shoulder pain developed, subscribe to the channel right now because every week we break down the real mechanical causes behind the mobility problems many people are told are simply part of aging. Share this video with anyone you know who struggles to lift their arms, reach shelves, or sleep comfortably because of shoulder pain. Somewhere right now, someone is being told their shoulder is simply wearing out when in reality the joint may just need its mechanical balance restored. When posture improves, stabilizing muscles strengthen, and the rotator cuff regains control of the humeral head, the shoulder joint often regains the space it needs for smooth, pain-free movement. And that means everyday actions, dressing, cooking, gardening, lifting grandchildren, even sleeping comfortably, can remain part of life for many years to come.